The gunshot comes through the cabin wall like thunder. Daniel Mercer is standing at his stove, making coffee before dawn, when the bullet splinters the wood inches from his head. He drops instinctively, and a second shot follows, then a third. "Come out," a voice roars. "Send her out, or I'll burn this cabin with you both inside it." Daniel knows that voice. He's heard it only once before, but he'll never forget it. It belongs to Victor Caine, a man whose reputation has spread across 3 territories like a bloodstain. Caine owns the land, owns the law, and owns anyone foolish enough to cross him. And Daniel has just crossed him by taking in his bride. The woman, Elizabeth, is huddled in the back room, wrapped in a blanket Daniel had given her, trembling so violently that Daniel can hear her teeth chattering from across the cabin. "I'm sorry," she's been repeating for hours. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I've destroyed you." She's right. But as another shot punches through the cabin wall and Daniel realizes his quiet, solitary life has ended in a single night, he doesn't regret his choice. "Stay back," he calls to her, then louder toward the door, "I'm coming out." "No!" Elizabeth cries. But Daniel is already moving toward the door, understanding with absolute clarity that the next few minutes will determine whether either of them lives to see another dawn. But before this moment shattered his world, let me take you back to where it all began. Daniel Mercer had chosen isolation deliberately. He was 44 years old, with the kind of face that had weathered decades of frontier sun and wind. His hands were strong from work, carpentry, ranching, whatever labor the territory required. His mind was quiet. His life was ordered. He lived in a small cabin on the eastern edge of settled territory, far enough from town that he rarely encountered other people. This was intentional. Years ago, Daniel had loved a woman. She'd married another man, a wealthier man with better prospects. The heartbreak was absolute, and when it healed into a scar that taught him solitude was safer than connection. His routine was perfect in its simplicity. Wake before dawn, work on the small ranch, raising cattle, maintaining fences, take his meals alone, read by lamplight in the evenings, sleep, repeat endlessly. This life had no drama, it had no surprises, it had no pain, which was the whole point. Then came the night of the wedding. Daniel had heard about Victor Caine's bride through town gossip. Caine had ridden to the capital and returned with a woman, Elizabeth Hartwell, daughter of a fallen merchant family. She was young, beautiful, refined, completely unsuited to the frontier. Everyone agreed that Caine had bought himself an ornament, and that she'd accepted the bargain because her family needed the money. The wedding was the social event of the season. Daniel didn't attend. He never attended anything in town. But that night, just after midnight, his cabin door shattered under a woman's desperate pounding. Elizabeth Hartwell stood there in her wedding dress, shredded and mudded, her hair unraveled, her eyes wild with panic. "Please," she gasped, "please, you have to let me in. He's coming. He'll be coming. He just told me what he was going to do to me, and I couldn't stay here." I didn't ask questions. I pulled her inside, bolted the door, and prepared myself for the inevitable consequences of my mercy. Elizabeth told her story in fragments. Victor Caine was not a man who abided defiance. She knew this, she said. She'd heard the stories before agreeing to marry him, but she thought she could manage him. She thought she could be the exception. She was wrong. On their wedding night, after the ceremony was over and they were alone, Caine had shown her his true face. He'd explained with meticulous detail that he'd bought her, that she belonged to him, that her will, her preferences, her body, all of it was now his property to do with as he pleased. When she'd objected, when she'd tried to resist, he'd shown her the scars on other women, women who'd belonged to him before, women who'd learned to obey. And then he told her exactly what he planned to do to her, describing it with clinical precision, designed to break her will. She'd ran. She'd escaped while he was momentarily distracted, and she'd run through the dark toward the only person she could think of who might offer sanctuary. A carpenter she'd seen in town, quiet and alone. Someone who seemed removed from Caine's web of control and fear. Miraculously, Daniel lived close enough to reach on foot. Now in his cabin, Elizabeth told him all of this. She wept. She apologized repeatedly. She begged him to help her escape further, to get her to the capital, to somewhere Caine's reach didn't extend. "I can give you money," she said desperately. "My father left me something. It's hidden in the capital. If you can get me there, I can repay you. I can ensure you're protected." "He won't stop coming," Daniel said quietly. "I know," Elizabeth said, "but maybe if you're not here when he arrives, maybe he'll just destroy the cabin and leave you alone." "He won't," Daniel said. "I took you in. That's enough for him. He'll see it as an insult." Daniel was right about this as the dawn revealed. 3 of Caine's men appeared on the ridge just as the sun broke the horizon. They were mounted, armed, moving with the casual confidence of men accustomed to violence. Behind them came a carriage, expensive, ornate, utterly out of place in the wilderness. And in the carriage, Daniel knew, would be Victor Caine. "He's here," Daniel said to Elizabeth. She moved to the window and saw them. Her entire body went rigid. "I'll leave," she said suddenly. "I'll ride out on your horse. I'll lead him away." "He won't follow you," Daniel said. "He'll stay here. He'll make sure I understand the cost of my interference." They watched together as the 3 riders surrounded the cabin. They watched as the carriage came to a stop and a man emerged. Even from a distance, Daniel could sense Caine's presence, not just his physical bulk, but the aura of controlled violence that seemed to emanate from him. This was a man who had never been told no, a man who had learned that overwhelming force could solve any problem, a man for whom morality was an inconvenience. Caine looked at the cabin. He looked at his 3 riders, and then he drew his revolver and fired 3 shots into the air. The statement was clear. "I'm here. Come out." Daniel understood that the moment of reckoning had arrived. "Send out my wife," Victor Caine called, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air, "and I'll let you live. Peep her, and I'll burn you both to ash." "She's not your wife," Daniel called back. "She's a person, and she chose to leave you." A long silence followed. Then Caine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think choice matters out here? You think a woman's preference supersedes a man's property rights? You're more naive than I thought, Carpenter." He raised his gun and fired at the cabin. The bullet splintered the wooden wall. He fired again and again. "Stop," Daniel said to Elizabeth. "Go to the back room. Stay low." Elizabeth started to argue, but Daniel was already moving toward the door. "If I die," he said to her, "there's a horse tied behind the cabin. Ride north. Don't stop. Keep riding until you reach the territorial capital. Ask for the governor. Tell him what Caine did to you. Tell him everything." "Daniel!" "Go," he said. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside. Victor Caine was a massive man, 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and a face scarred from decades of violence. His eyes were ice, utterly devoid of mercy or hesitation. He smiled when he saw Daniel. "Well," Caine said, "the hero emerges. Tell me, Carpenter, do you even know how to shoot? Do you think you can stand against me?" "No, I don't," Daniel said, honestly. "Then this will be quick," Caine said. He raised his gun. One of his riders moved toward the cabin, clearly intended to go inside and drag Elizabeth out. Daniel had perhaps 30 seconds before everything collapsed. That's when the first shot rang out. Not from Caine, from the ridge. The rider moving toward the cabin fell from his horse, blood blooming across his chest. The other two riders looked up in shock. Another shot and a second rider fell. From the ridge, emerging on horseback, came a woman. She was riding hard, rifle in hand, and she was firing with the precision of someone who'd been trained for exactly this moment. It was Elizabeth's mother. She descended the ridge, and behind her came 4 armed men, marshals from the territorial capital, recognizable by their official insignia. The marshal in front was a man named Harrison, known for his hatred of frontier predators like Caine. "Victor Caine, you're under arrest for unlawful imprisonment, assault, and violation of Territorial Statute 17, which prohibits claims of ownership over persons." Caine's face went white with rage. He looked around at the encircling lawmen, at Elizabeth's mother reloading her rifle, at the sudden reversal of his total power. For a moment, I thought Caine would fight. Thought he'd go out in a blaze of gunfire, die rather than submit to the law he'd always seen as beneath him. But Caine was also pragmatic. He lowered his gun. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "That woman is my legal wife. She belongs to me." "She's a person," Elizabeth's mother said, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. "And she sent a letter to the capital 3 weeks ago, before the wedding, detailing her concerns about you. The territorial governor took those concerns seriously." Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, and her mother rushed to her, embracing her fiercely. How did you—" "I hired investigators. I learned who Victor Caine really was. I saw the pattern of women who disappeared under his care. I wasn't about to let my daughter become another victim." Victor Caine was taken into custody. But before the marshals could place the shackles, Caine's face twisted with rage, and he lunged at Daniel with a knife, appearing from nowhere, the blade glinting in the morning light. Daniel had no weapon. He had no training, but he had the advantage of terrain and surprise. As Caine charged, Daniel sidestepped and grabbed a fence post leaning against the cabin. He swung it with all his strength. The impact caught Caine across the ribs and sent him sprawling. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. One of the marshals was on him immediately, securing him with shackles and chains. Caine lay on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, staring at Daniel with such pure hatred that it seemed like a physical force. "This isn't over," Caine hissed. "You've made an enemy, Carpenter. I have friends. I have reach. Even from prison You'll what?" Marshal Harrison said coldly. "You'll commit more crimes? That just extends your sentence." They took Caine away, placing him in a secure wagon with 2 guards. His remaining rider, the one who'd survived, followed along now a prisoner himself. Daniel stood in the morning light, barely comprehending what had just happened. His quiet, orderly life had been shattered in a single night, and now, just as suddenly, it had been restored. But not as it had been. Elizabeth approached him carefully. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I don't need to," Daniel said. "I just did what I could do. You risked everything. You put yourself between a desperate woman and a dangerous man. That's not something I can forget. That's not something I will forget." Her mother joined him, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "My daughter mentioned your kindness, your willingness to help a stranger in need. That speaks volumes about your character, Mr. Mercer. I hope you'll allow me to repay that kindness somehow." "There's no debt," Daniel said. "There is," Elizabeth's mother said firmly, "whether you acknowledge it or not, and I'm a woman who pays her debts." They stopped at a high camp as the sun began to set. Sarah told James everything. How her brother William had discovered that the Northern Syndicate was trafficking in stolen territorial land claims. How he'd stolen proof of their crimes, records, ledgers, everything. How he'd hidden it all with the money in a canyon only she could find. How the syndicate had tracked him down and killed him, and then erased Sarah from their minds completely when they couldn't find her in the immediate aftermath. How she'd run and eventually collapsed from a head injury and loss of memory, a blessing that had protected her by making her forgettable. "My memory was my protection," Sarah said. "As long as I didn't remember who I was, I couldn't lead them to the money or the evidence." "And now that you do remember?" James asked. "Now I have a choice," Sarah said. "I can take you to the money and the evidence, and we can expose the syndicate. We can go to the territorial capital with proof of what they've done. We can bring them down." "And the cost?" "The cost is they'll hunt us forever, or until we die, or until they do." James looked at this young woman, Sarah Garrett, with her fully restored memory, with the weight of her brother's death finally on her shoulders. He thought about his life of solitude, about the choice he'd made to involve himself, about the inevitable consequences. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long time. She looked out at the mountains, at the fading light, at the vast indifference of the frontier. "I want to honor my brother," she said finally. "I want to stop the people who killed him. I want to burn them to ash with the truth." James nodded. He'd expected nothing less. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. And in that moment, he understood why the frontier made men and women capable of extraordinary things. It wasn't because they were braver than other people. It was because the frontier had a way of stripping away everything except the essential question: who are you when everything else is taken away? For James, the answer had always been, "I'm a man who doesn't get involved." But holding Sarah's hand as she faced down the prospect of a lifetime hunted, he realized he'd been wrong about himself all along. He was a man who, when faced with an innocent person in need, would choose involvement. He would choose risk. He would choose to fight. And perhaps that made him more alive than his lonely years had ever made him. It took 6 months. They rode to the canyon where William had hidden the evidence and the money. They gathered it all, the records, the ledgers, the documentation of the syndicate's crimes, and they rode to the territorial capital. The investigation that followed dismantled the Northern Syndicate. 12 of their leadership were arrested. The territorial governor implemented new protections for land claims. Justice, imperfect but real, was done. The Caldwell gang and the Hernandez family scattered, their common alliance shattered when their common enemy fell. But Sarah's victory came with a cost. The Northern Syndicate, even as they fell, put out contracts on both her and James. For years afterward, they looked over their shoulders. They took different routes. They changed their names and their appearance. They lived the lives of people constantly hunted. But they lived. And they lived together. Sarah stayed with James on his small ranch outside the territories. She helped him tend the land. She helped him build a life that acknowledged danger but didn't surrender to it. On quiet evenings, as the sun set over the mountains, Sarah would tell James about her brother, about the man he'd been, about the choice he'd made to stand against corruption even though it cost him his life. And James would listen, and he would understand that his life of solitude had ended the moment a broken girl walked into a frontier saloon with empty eyes and a desperate need. 3 gangs wanted her dead. In the end, only one small man and one brave woman survived the reckoning. But they survived, and that was enough. Thank you for listening to this tale here on Frontier Love Tools. A girl with no memory appeared, and 3 gangs wanted her dead. But in protecting her, one man discovered who he truly was. And in recovering her memory, one woman found the courage to finish what her brother started. This is a story about how a single act of mercy can set in motion the collapse of empires, how the powerless can challenge the powerful, how remembering who we are can save more than just ourselves. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, because out here, every sunset hides another story waiting to be told. Stories of survival, stories of sacrifice, stories of the bonds that connect us across the loneliness of the frontier. We'll see you next time.